This is DW News live from Berlin. Chancellor Olaf Scholz gives a key policy speech to the German parliament. The war in Ukraine and Germany's response to it is expected to dominate. The Chancellor's address comes ahead of an EU summit of leaders in the coming hours. This is DW News live from Berlin. Chancellor Olaf Scholz gives a key policy speech to the German parliament. Very soon, we will be tuning in for that speech and also crossing live to our correspondent in a moment. I'm Ben Fazul and welcome. The war in Ukraine and Germany's response to it is expected to dominate this speech. It comes ahead of an EU summit of leaders in the coming hours. Well, let's go over to our correspondent, Nina Haase, who's standing by for us. Our political correspondent. Can we bring in Nina, please? Nina, what kind of speech can we expect from the Chancellor today, and what will he use this occasion to convey?
Well, it's a tradition that German chancellors give a big speech ahead of every EU council, so that's not like an emergency speech today, what we're going to be seeing. But he's going to stress why his decisions in recent weeks and months have been right. And especially when it comes to support for Ukraine, he does need to have everybody's support. He does need to have the backing because, of course, the efforts to support Ukraine are also having implications on domestic politics. And so this is something where he's going to try and convey to members of parliament here just why it's necessary to continue supporting Ukraine militarily, but also financially, unconditionally, essentially, as long as it takes. This has been the message. But then he's probably also going to tackle the issue of energy and just how the governments across Europe are going to try and prevent prices from going up through the roofs. And this is something that he's going to have to explain because it's also Germany's measures have drawn criticism from other EU partners.
As long as it takes. And it would be interesting to see if there are any solutions in this speech as far as ending this war, which has been going on for some 8 months. Germany recently sent its first air defence system to Ukraine. Can we expect more modern arms as urgently requested by the Ukrainian government?
Well, politicians here in Berlin are stressing more and more that this war hasn't just gone on for 8 months. It has, in fact, gone on for 8 years. It started with the invasion of Crimea. But, of course, this current phase, started in February. So this is something where Olaf Scholz has repeatedly also said that we are going to have to prepare ourselves for a situation in which Putin is going to try and basically destroy Ukraine as a nation, and that nobody knows just how long he's going to be able to do that, and that everything needs to be done to help Ukraine defend its own sovereign territory. So this is something where we're not going to expect Olaf Scholz to announce new arms deliveries to Ukraine. Germany has, you mustn't forget, delivered the first air defense system, IRIS-T, to Ukraine. That was a vital step because, of course, Germany had also been criticized for being too reluctant, too slow, not delivering enough. But with this IRIS-T now in use in Ukraine, that has also managed to restore trust somewhat between Ukraine and Germany. The next 3 models are going to arrive in Ukraine from Germany in the course of the next year. So Germany has been doing a lot more than people have criticized it for. But Olaf Scholz will probably also focus on just how nations, G7, but also the EU can help Ukraine recover, and how those partners can essentially help the country reconstruct itself, how Ukraine's economy can be revived. And Olaf Scholz is going to invite partners like the IMF and the European Investment Bank to Berlin next week, where they'll be discussing exactly that point. What needs to be done so that Ukraine can continue existing as a country? This is something that he's probably also going to highlight.
Well, we're still waiting for Mr. Schultz to address Parliament. But while we're waiting, let's pick up on a point you made there, Nina. Trust which is based, of course, on or is built through unity. And Schultz is giving this speech ahead of an EU summit in a few hours where soaring energy costs will be top of the agenda. Germany had drawn criticism for announcing its own huge energy aid package without first going through the French. And that's causing a few problems between the two big economies of the EU. Do you expect the Chancellor to change this plan?
Well, negotiations are ongoing. What Germany keeps stressing, and the Chancellor himself as well, is that Germany has adopted measures that are in line with EU rules. So he says there can be no talk of Germany going it alone. He says, of course, because we're a big nation, everybody is watching us all this more closely. But essentially, Germany has promised German voters that 200 billion euros will be spent, up to 200 billion euros over the next 3 years, so that consumers but also companies can deal with those high energy prices. Now, that has drawn criticism from EU partners because, of course, not every country has the financial coffers where they can just pull out money like that, like Germany is promising to do. But then the topic of energy, of course, is something where Olaf Scholz has said this is just a measure that we need for the transition period. We need to become more sovereign. We need to become more independent. We do need to take these measures at the moment, but what we also need to talk about, he says, is the transition towards a green economy, so how to boost investment in renewable energy sources, for example. And there are a couple of proposals on the table from the European Commission, and Germany's position there is something that is, again, also drawing criticism, because Germany says it's not a good idea to essentially set up some sort of a dynamic price cap, as Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the Commission, has suggested, because that would essentially mean that security of energy supply can't be guaranteed. It's a complicated thing, but Olaf Scholz says if we decide in the EU to essentially cap the prices for gas, then the ships that will transport gas might just go off to Asian countries, to other countries that also need gas, because of course they want the higher prices. So this is going to be a very big discussion all night in Brussels. We're expecting a very late press conference because of course the issue of energy security is something where all the governments are under pressure to deliver solutions to their own populations, to their voters. There's a big fear that here in Europe there could be social unrest.
There, Nina, and get back to you in a minute. The Chancellor is now beginning his speech.
Madam Speaker, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the brutal war in Ukraine, Putin's merciless weaponizing of hunger and energy, the enormous price rises here and worldwide, Germany and Europe are experiencing testing times we haven't known in decades. Tests which Putin forced on us with his imperialist war of aggression. All war presupposes human weakness and seeks to exploit it, Karl von Clausewitz wrote. That's how Putin acts. He subjects Ukraine to terror, blatantly, without any responsibility, threatens the use of nuclear weapons to the world. He wants to sow fear, divide and intimidate. He speculates that we are weak, but he's wrong. We are not weak. Our country stays together, Europe stands together and shows solidarity with each other and with Ukraine. Our global alliances are strong and alive as never before. Putin will not achieve his war aims. When Putin started the war in February, several speculated Ukraine will be vanquished in a matter of days. Putin himself believed that too. Well, it came differently. It happened differently because Ukrainians bravely defended their country. with high and painful sacrifice. It happened differently also because the partners of Ukraine, including us, supported this country in political, financial, humanitarian terms and by supplying weapons. Artillery and air defense, that's what Ukraine needs particularly urgently, and that's exactly what we supply. We have modern tank howitzers, we have multiple rocket launcher systems. The backfill deal with the Czechs, with Slovakia, with Greece and Slovenia has been criticised by some people here as being damp squibs, but now it has become clear that this way Ukraine receives a good 100 tanks that their soldiers can use immediately. We are one of the first countries at the beginning of June to pledge modern air defense system, and the first one was actually handed over to Ukrainian weeks last week, earlier than planned, and 3 more will follow as soon as possible. We have supplied anti-aircraft missiles, we have supplied manpads and the Gepard anti-aircraft vehicles where people said, oh, they won't do anything, there isn't even enough ammo for it. Now we see they make a real difference. How vital our support is shown by the brutal Russian attacks by rocket and drones on the civilian targets, which we've seen in previous fortnight. They're random victims, men, women and children. Even those who, like you, Mr. Schultz, have experienced persecution and terror and survived it, you again have to fear for their lives, and we are really honoured to have you today as our guest. Even the most recent escalations coming from Moscow do not remain unanswered. We have another packet of sanctions, which means the EU is increasing the pressure on the Russian government, and we will stick to that course while Russia continues this brutal war of aggression. Even in the circle of the G7 heads of state and government last week, together with President Zelensky, we reaffirmed that intentional attacks against the civilian population constitute war crimes. To put it bluntly, even this type of scorched earth tactics will not help Russia win this war. It only reaffirms the determination, the endurance of Ukraine and its partners. In the end, Russia's terror of bombs and missiles is an act of desperation, just like the mobilization of Russian men for war. This means that finally the war's reached the very heart of Russian society. It's reached families and the streets. Hundreds of thousands of Russians avoid the draft. Many are leaving the country. All these lies, the propaganda, the talk of special operations and fast wins, all this is just like a stage setting, like a Potemkin village. Ukraine will successfully defend itself, and we will support this country as long as it takes. Putin thought he could divide us Europeans, but he's achieved the opposite. A few days ago, at the founding meeting of the European Political Community, 44 European countries and the EU institutions have reaffirmed the principles that borders must not be moved by force. Not one of us and no other civilized country in the world accepts the very clear attempts that Russia is using to try and gain parts of Ukraine for itself. The illegal sham referenda in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia were just a farce, and their results are nil and void. The Russian leadership should understand this when they're looking at the result of the vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations last week. North Korea, Syria, Nicaragua and Belarus. These were the only 4 countries that voted with Russia. 143 countries, by contrast, clearly committed to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Actually, more this time than in the March vote, which was taken after the war started. At the same time, many people ask themselves how this crazy war of Putin's could be ended, but most, I think, the Ukrainians wish for peace. President Zelensky's readiness to embrace a just peace cannot be overestimated, therefore. In close contact with our friends in Kyiv, we, as the G7, declared a few days ago what exactly is necessary to achieve that. A just peace means it must not be a peace dictated, but the sovereignty, territorial integrity and defence capability of Ukraine must be guaranteed today and in the future. Our willingness to give long-term security guarantees to Ukraine with a view to a truly viable peace solution is something which we have reaffirmed again at the G7 meeting. And the European Council meeting, which starts today, will also see deliberations on further support for Ukraine. The good news is that the financial requirements for Kyiv until the end of the year has been more or less covered, with the EU and the G7 playing a decisive role. But the war and its consequences will keep us busy for many years to come. It's all the more important, therefore, to think today what we can do to support Ukraine in reconstruction in the future. If you've seen the pictures of the villages and towns which have been liberated from Russian occupation, will understand that this is a job for generations, where all the civilized world will need to bundle its strength. And that is why Ursula von der Leyen and I, as president of the G7, of the economically strong democracies, have put together bright minds from academia, business and the civil society to come to Berlin on 25 October. There's going to be an international meeting of experts where proposals can be made for a long-term, reliable and transparent reconstruction of Ukraine. And thus, they will provide an input for an international Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Closer European and international coordination is also necessary when it comes to the military support for Ukraine. That's a suggestion I already made when I spoke at the Charles University in Prague in late August. This idea has since moved on. On Monday, the EU foreign ministers decided on a new training mission for about 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers here in the European Union. One of the two headquarters is going to be in Germany. And until spring, we're going to train a full brigade with up to 5,000 soldiers. Thus, we underline our willingness to be involved in the long run for building up Ukrainian armed forces hand in hand with our partners. In the light of these changing times, we also change our own security policy set up in Germany. Reason for that was the special assets made available for the armed forces, the refocusing of our armed forces to national defence and NATO, and to take over greater responsibility on the alliance's eastern flank. And another point is the national security strategy we're developing. And there are also proposals for security cooperation in Europe, which I've outlined in my Prague speech. I'm very happy that the idea of closer cooperation in Europe when it comes to air defence was so quickly taken up by 14 other European countries who've expressed their willingness to work on that with us. That's exactly the type of synergy, the kind of very smart division of labour that we will need for Europe's security now. The Russian war, though, does not only have profound consequences for Europe. All over the world, it has caused bottlenecks when it comes to fuels and food and fertilizer, with fatal consequences. 830 million, more than 1 in 10 people on this planet, haven't got enough to eat. Putin doesn't just accept that, he uses hunger as a weapon. We need to face up to this test too. It's a question of humanity. It is also a question of our credibility. If we want the countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean to provide support in the future as well to defend international law against aggression such as the Russian aggression, then it's only necessary that we take seriously their concerns when it comes to coping with the consequences of this Russian war. We started very early in the European Union to find alternative ways of exporting Ukrainian grain using the railways or sea routes like the Danube River. We have also supported the United Nations and Turkey when it comes to negotiating to opening up sea routes in the Black Sea, and we are helping countries all over the world who are dealing with crop failures, with hunger, and with price hikes for bread and other basic foodstuffs. One of these central objectives of the G7 was setting up an alliance for global food safety, and I'm very glad we managed to do so. And this year's pledges of the G7 amounting to $14 billion, we have at least an opportunity to avert a global hunger disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, energy is weaponized by Putin too. Long before destroying the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea, Russia already cut its deliveries via Nord Stream 1 without any comprehensible reason. So, this Russia under Putin is no longer a reliable trade partner. For us and for all the world, it means a large part of the 155 billion cubic meters of gas that Russia used to ship to Europe through its pipelines is now missing in the world market. Putin hoped by turning off the gas he'd be able to blackmail us. But he miscalculated there as well. Because Europe stands together, and we as a country have made sure through the measures taken in recent weeks and months that we can say with optimism, together we will come through this winter. In no time at all, we were able to build up alternative infrastructures for imports. The first LNG terminals in Wilhelmshaven and Brunsbüttel will come online before the end of the year, and the first deliveries via Lubmin may well follow. More terminals will be added in the course of the next year. For the past week, we've had the first gas coming to us from France, and the capacities in the West European ports from the Netherlands and Belgium are also used in order to acquire additional gas supplies. Reliable partners such as Norway have increased their deliveries to us. When it comes to the United States and the countries of the Arab Peninsula, we've concluded new supply contracts and more are being prepared. All these measures have been instrumental in filling our gas storage in Europe and in Germany in time for the winter, better than last year, by the way. The level of 95% gas storage available, which we wanted to achieve by the 1st of November, has already been exceeded. That's a huge achievement. We've decided that we will reconnect coal-fired power plants to the grid. Just recently, 5 more huge lignite power plant units in Lusatia and in the Rhine Valley have been added. A measure limited in time, but still necessary as an emergency measure, because we stand by our climate targets, which we set. We make sure that all 3 of our still operational nuclear power plants can be used for all of the winter. That's what the Cabinet prepared the ground for yesterday. And finally, companies have made it easier to move from gas to other energy sources. Fuel switch is the buzzword here. All of this strengthens the energy supply security of Germany and Europe. In addition, there are the savings efforts undertaken by many of our citizens and companies, for which I am truly very grateful. Working together, we want to reduce our gas consumption by 20%, because every kilowatt hour we save will increase our energy security. And I'm glad that we managed at the European level to agree on a savings target of 15% in gas consumption. That sends out a strong signal of European solidarity, particularly vis-à-vis our own country, which until now was particularly dependent on Russian gas. Was is the operative word, because we have freed ourselves from this dependence and are well prepared when it comes to this coming winter. And there is one more thing I would like to mention. When we're talking about energy security, our security and law enforcement agencies, the federal police, the various federal criminal office organizations, the BSI, we're all doing everything we can in order to protect our critical infrastructure, working together with the providers and operators. We're also agreeing with the partners in both the EU and NATO. We have close agreement with Sweden and Denmark when it comes to resolving the acts of sabotage perpetrated against the two Nord Stream pipelines. The Navy, the federal police have everything available, showing a military presence. And this year we also want to decide on cornerstones for an umbrella law to better protect critical infrastructure. We know that given the size and complexity of critical infrastructure, there is no such thing as absolute security. But we prepare, and above all, we will not be intimidated. Ladies and gentlemen, energy security is one thing. The energy prices, which are far too high, that's another huge test for our country and for Europe. No question. The prices for electricity, for heating, gas, oil and coal need to go down to a level which is acceptable for our citizens and our companies. That will rightly be one of the issues to be discussed at the European Council meeting today and tomorrow in Brussels. We have decided here in Germany we will put in a ceiling for electricity prices parallel to the decisions made at the European level, and we're working quickly at trying to implement that quickly. The idea is that citizens will be relieved a bit by a basic contingent of electricity. We've tried to do it the European way, and within very few weeks we got majorities in Europe on our side. What this shows us that the EU is capable to act in these questions, and Germany will always make sure that this European capability will always be strengthened. When it comes to gas and heating prices, the matter is more complex, because the gas price is decided by scarcities in the global market. But here too, we have reached far at the European level. At the Council meeting today, we are going to discuss bundling our demand. So I'm very grateful to the European Commission for the proposal to build sort of purchasing communities of European countries, which will then jointly buy gas. It's also right that some of the capacities of European gas storage systems will be filled together in the next year. The model Trading Up Europe has shown the way. By developing an additional gas price index, additional to the TTF, we are going to think about how that can be done. It could be a reference point for future gas import contracts. The best remedy against scarce supplies, though, is to quickly develop renewable energies, and the Commission has already made some suggestions for simplified planning procedures, which we want to also apply to the large grids, and that's something which I will try to strongly advocate at the Council meeting. To replace the Russian gas supplies which have been cancelled, we also need to work with countries when it's possible to open up new gas fields. All of that, of course, within the framework of the obligations we entered into in the Paris Climate Accord. We're also going to discuss how we're dealing with price hikes. The Commission proposals on that will be scrutinised very closely. A price ceiling imposed by politics always has a bit of a risk that producers will simply sell their gas elsewhere, and we in Europe will not end up getting more but less gas. So the EU needs to agree with other gas-consuming countries like Japan and Korea, so we don't end up competing with each other. And we're also talking about an appropriate price with the producers. I'm convinced that countries such as the US, Canada or Norway, countries that together with us are showing solidarity to Ukraine, have an interest in making sure that energy in Europe will not become unaffordable. We're also discussing that within the G7. ultimately the G7, in those days it was still the G6, it was actually established as an answer to the first oil crisis of the 1970s and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. At the time, it was possible to lead the world back to a path of growth, and that is my idea as the current G7 chair. Obviously, in parallel, we're using the opportunities we have as an economy in order to get the gas and heating prices down to an acceptable level. That's why we have an economic defensive shield worth 200 billion euros. Which also contains this gas price ceiling. We have a commission set up from academics, scientists, employers, unions, municipal utilities and energy providers, and they made a suggestion to us last week how we could really strongly limit the price hikes for gas and district heating. The measures suggested all have one thing in common. They keep energy affordable, act fast, and do not exclude incentives for savings. And that's what we are now implementing. At the latest March next year, all citizens that receive gas or district heating will get a sort of base contingent at a better price. In order to make sure we can provide relief early on, the Commission has suggested that the utilities will get money for this payment on account by the country already in December. And we also want to target assistance for companies both big and small. And so we can say today, no single family, no pensioner, no student or company needs to be afraid not to be able to meet the prices for electricity, gas or district heating. We have carefully prepared our defensive shield for 2.5 years so as to be prepared for the next winter too. Looking at that timescale, the 200 billion euros approximated 2% of our GDP. That's about the scale of the packages for assistance which other countries in Europe are preparing and will be preparing, such as France, Italy or Spain. The European Union also has sufficient financial effectiveness to withstand this crisis. From the RRF, the Reconstruction and Resilience Facility, which we decided during the COVID pandemic, only a fifth of the funds have been paid out, which means that more than 600 billion euros are still available to strengthen our national economies and to use for extending renewable energy. The fact we've agreed to finance Repower EU, which was achieved very recently by European Ministers of Finance, making available 3 digits of billions from the Next Generation EU funds so that we can become independent of fossil fuels. I'm willing to see how these and other available funds can be used more efficiently given this current crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, it is this European solidarity that makes sure the European Union does not succumb to Putin's energy blackmail. But, dear colleagues, over all these tests that we are now facing because of this war of aggression, there's one thing we mustn't lose sight of. Our target is to phase out fossil resources. We need to develop renewable energies and grids, have more energy efficiency. That's the best strategy for making sure we have both affordable and secure energy supplies. Every wind turbine, onshore or offshore, every PV system makes us just that little bit more independent of expensive oil and gas. The transformation of the energy sector of our industry, the modernization of our buildings, extending the railway and municipal public transport system, revving up e-mobility and hydrogen, that is what we are really doing as a central job for the decade. And things have been put in motion. We've got the most comprehensive amendment of the Renewable Energies Act of the last decade. That's been decided. We are also accelerating the development of offshore wind power. We're going to have a new onshore wind power law coming into force, which will make available 2% of the area of our country for wind power. And in the autumn, another package for accelerating planning procedures will be decided. Because what I promised at the end of the year will be kept. All rules, regulations, laws that are needed for Germany to make its climate targets will be firmly in place before the end of the year. At the EU level, we stay the course as well. In the coming months, we want to come to final agreements on the Fit for 55 package, which will serve a booster for international climate protection. With the forthcoming European Council meeting, our position for the World Climate Conference in Sharm el-Sheikh will be agreed on. The Russian aggression and its consequences must not lead to a global renaissance of coal. So we are going to put clear offers on the table so that the developing countries and the newly developing countries will also be able to go towards climate neutrality, and will help those countries suffering from the consequences of climate change already. Colleagues, the tests we are facing these days require all of us to think new and be brave. Fast, with a lot of pressure. In recent months, we were able to make decisions that reach far into the future. We did so for Europe, for our country, for our citizens. And in this process, we kept thinking, fighting for the best way ahead. And that's what we will do in the future as well, because it matters. In an autocracy like Russia, the target is the best, greatest uniformity. Creativity, contradiction are punished. Brave opposition members disappear into prisons for many years or are forced into exile. Last but not least, we see what some of the Nobel Peace Prize winners this year have seen. That is a shame we are reminded of. But in this, our democracy, our debates, the free media, public criticism, give new impetus for change and progress all the time. That is the strength of an open society. That is the strength of a democracy. This strength, this power, ladies and gentlemen, is what Putin and his followers are dramatically underestimating. And that's why I am more sure than ever. Putin's war against Ukraine and all of the free world will fail. Really, it already has. Ukraine, Germany and Europe, however, will remain strengthened from these tests, more united and more independent than before. Thank you.
More united and more independent. You heard it there from Olaf Scholz, Germany's Chancellor there. His aims in the face of this war in Ukraine and the global energy crisis. Germany, of course, not the only one facing these problems that so many countries around the world are facing right now as a result of the war. In a moment, we'll go to our correspondent to talk more about that. Our correspondent at the Parliament, who's been listening to Olaf Scholz's speech, and in a moment to our correspondent in Ukraine. First to Nina Hase, who's been listening to the speech. Nina, what stood out to you most from the German Chancellor's address to the German Parliament?
Well, Ben, to be honest, one of the strongest moments I thought in this speech was when Olaf Scholz called the air attacks, so those deliberate attacks on the civilian population in Kyiv and other cities, a war crime. by Putin. Now, Olaf Scholz is careful when he uses words in the public sphere, but he already, after the atrocity in Bucha back in April, he used the term war crimes, and he reiterated that now today. And this is probably also something that he sees necessary to convince people that support for Ukraine has to go on for quite some time. That is something that came across very strongly in this speech, that he says it's a generational task to rebuild this country, and it's the West's job to help Ukraine with this effort. And he, in this context, mentioned the big international conference that he's organizing for next week, where he's bringing together experts, the IMF, the Investment Bank on the European level, to help discuss essentially how Ukraine can be helped in this matter. Then he spoke at length about energy security, and he said, actually, we're doing quite well. Gas storage facilities are filled here in Germany, so there's no need to worry about this winter. This was probably also targeting the domestic population at home, German voters who are very worried, and we are beginning to see demonstrations in Germany across the country protesting against those high costs of living. So he spoke at length about this and tried to make people understand just what the government is doing there. But when it comes to the issue of energy prices, he said that is a different matter. Energy prices are going through the roof, and there are different proposals on the table, also from Brussels, from the European Commission, where Germany is not exactly in line with other European partners, just which method is the best to use so that prices can be capped. So we are expecting long discussions in Brussels tonight over this issue, because, of course, this was a speech that he gave before travelling to Brussels.
The problem being, of course, that there are two huge challenges here. This is not just an energy crisis, it's a climate crisis. So trying to shift to renewables, but trying to make a quick shift away from Russian energy, which can't happen overnight, but which politicians have been talking about for months now. And of course, all of us are looking for solutions, just like the German Chancellor is. To bring us back to Ukraine, though, to Russia's war, which has sparked this energy crisis. What did the Chancellor have to say there for the people of Ukraine? What did he have to say as far as weapons go?
Well, essentially, his message to the Ukrainian people were, you can trust Germany. Now, that is not something that you can take for granted. There is a discussion in the Baltic states and in Poland and in parts of Ukraine as well. Can we trust Germany? Is it willing to make sacrifices in this fight against the Russian threat, essentially? And so this was a very clear message from the German Chancellor to the Ukrainian people. Yes, you can trust us. We've delivered an air defense system that we haven't been able to afford for ourselves, for example, and 3 more such systems of the IRST are going to follow. He also spoke about the EU training mission, where Germany is going to help train Ukrainian soldiers. They're setting up a new brigade, and of course, the financial security of Ukraine, he said, is also safeguarded until the end of this year. So he reiterated essentially that Germany stands by Ukraine.
And some of those soldiers to be trained at a headquarters to be set up here in Germany. Nina Hase, thank you very much for the analysis. As I promised, let's go to Matthias Böllinger, who's in Kyiv and joins me now. What is the Ukrainian government likely to make of what Chancellor Scholz just had to say there?
Well, Scholz, of course, said the things that, from the Ukrainian point of view, were necessary for him to say, that Ukraine was expecting him to say, that he will continue supporting militarily and also financially, also the reconstruction of the country. But the question is, of course, what's the substance of what he said? And he basically talked about what he has already done. Now, the criticism of Germany that was very harsh in the beginning of the war, because Germany was reluctant to provide weapons, has somewhat softened. But Germany is still considered a country that is, well, never very much is not leading in these discussions. There needs to be convinced very slowly, and this speech is certainly not going to change that. But on the other hand, of course, discussions about weapons systems, about deliveries of weapons systems, about financial aid, they are not solved via public speeches, but via diplomacy, via talks between the two sides. And that's, of course, something that is happening. We've seen this week there was another talk between the Minister of Defense of Ukraine and of Germany. So these talks are going on. The substance is decided there, not in public speeches. But it's if somebody had expected that Scholz might come out with new announcements, this has definitely not happened in this speech. It's pretty much even the wording, things that he has said before.
So just to make it very clear to our viewers, Germany has said it will continue to help defend Ukraine or help Ukraine defend itself as long as it takes. Its help and support will continue, but today no new promises of any new weapons of any kind there. That is what Kyiv has been demanding, though. How urgent are Ukraine's needs for more support now?
The past 2 weeks, the attacks on many cities in Ukraine, including the capital Kyiv, have shown that the weak spot is still air defense. And air defense is something that Germany has been providing, the IRIS-T, the system, the very modern system, rocket-based system that can hit, for example, planes and rockets, is working, we are hearing. The 3 more are weighted now. Ukraine is asking for systems that would be more effective against drones, that would be smaller and more flexible systems, also systems that jam drones. German companies are making these, among others, and that's something they're discussing about. I mean, Germany is not reluctant to deliver these systems. It depends, of course, on the time it needs to produce them, etc. But air defense is something that Germany has been doing also with these Gepard tanks. The more critical or the more controversial topic are tanks, are battle tanks that can be used in battles. Germany is still reluctant there. There was no new announcement. These tanks would be needed in the counter-offensives. Scholz has talked about the tank swaps, where Germany provides modern tanks to Eastern European countries, EU members, and they then ship their old Soviet tanks to Ukraine. That also helps, but it's of course not what Ukraine is hoping for in the longer run. In the longer run, they want more modern systems. That's the point where the two countries are really far away from each other. And I think the one thing that we should be looking for in the next weeks, again, Scholz has said nothing about it, is whether Germany will be providing Ukraine with more modern air defense systems. That's something to watch. The speech hasn't said any, it wasn't about it, but we are waiting for
air defense systems, because as we've seen, Matthias, just in the past 2 weeks, last week, the rocket attacks and strikes across Ukraine, in Kyiv as well, and then these drone attacks that we've seen an increase in drones that are allegedly coming from Iran. Talk also today of missiles possibly also being delivered by Iran to Russia, which both allegations which have been denied by Iran. But give us an idea of the picture of where we're at in this war. Also in the south, in Kherson, hundreds of thousands of people on the move, trying to get away from this war or being ordered to leave Russian-occupied territory.
Yeah, Russia is in the defensive, is losing on the battlefield. So the Russian General Staff, the commander for the operations here in Ukraine, for Russia's troops in Ukraine, has said that they are in a difficult position in Kherson, and they're expecting an attack by the Ukrainian army on Kherson, an attempt to retake the city and the territories around it. That's pretty serious because usually armies do not admit that they're in difficult positions unless they really are. They've also started to what they call evacuate people, which some here fear might be forced deportations, forced movements of people out of these areas to either other occupied territories or even to Russia. And all that points to either Ukraine really being on the offensive there. We don't get a lot of information from Ukraine. Ukraine is very tight-lipped about its operations usually until they're done. That has to do with operational security. We don't really know that. The Russian analysts have said that Ukraine might have amassed tens of thousands of soldiers there, but it could also be an indication that Russia is preparing a retreat from these areas. There has been some talk about that, and that's what, for example, British military intelligence is suggesting, that these talks about difficulties were preparing the Russian public for a retreat. So Russia on the defensive, on retreat even on the battlefield, and they are stepping up their bombardments of civilian infrastructure, of energy infrastructure here in order to either intimidate the population, maybe pressure them into a more defensive position, into giving up some of the objectives of this war, which is not really working. If you've been following this war, the more brutal Russia was behaving in this war, the more determined the Ukrainian public was. And the other thing is, by targeting energy infrastructure, is of course weakening the economy, and the economy is of course something that even a country at war relies on. These wars need to be financed. That was also an important point in Scholz's speech, that he said that the financial aid and financial commitment to Ukraine will continue. That's definitely necessary because besides fighting at the front lines, a war needs to be financed, of course.
Matthias Böllinger, our correspondent in Kyiv, there, pointing out a very interesting topic, and that is of energy. I mean, we're all worried here in Europe at the moment about an energy crisis. The people of Ukraine have been told to turn out the lights today, to go without power from 7 in the morning till 11 at night, because Russia is, as Matthias points out, they're targeting infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And it is a very hard time for the Ukrainians, not just on the front line, but those who are also trying to, get about and live their lives in a country that's in a war right now. Matthias also talked about the Chancellor's speech there. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz just gave a policy statement to the German Parliament ahead of a key meeting of EU leaders starting in Brussels later. The energy crisis and a looming recession, don't forget that. They're just two of the challenges facing the EU right now and will likely dominate talks in Brussels. The war in Ukraine has driven up energy costs, and there's fear that public support for Ukraine could wane as winter bites. So EU leaders will be looking at ways of cutting energy costs for consumers. Here's a look at how.
Skyrocketing prices for gas and oil have created major headaches for many Europeans. Now, European governments want to change that.
At the EU leaders' last summit earlier this month, everyone agreed. Energy prices have to go down. Now, several suggestions are on the table for their next meeting here in Brussels.
The first proposal on the table is joint purchasing. With this model, energy supplies would be bought at a European Union level rather than a national one and subsequently distributed. This could bring down prices due to the increased purchasing power, but might need some time to be set up. The second proposal is agreeing on a maximum price limit paid for gas by all European importers. The intention is to prevent some of the price spikes seen in recent months. But this measure comes with certain pros and cons.
The advantage of this measure is that it could really reduce energy prices quite quickly, and at the same time it wouldn't cost anything to European states. But that, of course, has the risk that suppliers will not deliver enough gas to European states because they have less incentives with a lower price to do so.
The third proposal is a solidarity mechanism. With this suggestion, EU countries would help each other out in times of emergency supply shortages, transferring energy from one country to another. But for some, that might be too much to ask for.
The problem is that a lot of especially richer countries will not necessarily agree on a mechanism that makes them pay for the woes of other countries. We've seen that in the past before. It's always been very difficult to agree on that. So why should it be different this time?
Another idea still being worked on is a cap on energy prices as done in Spain. Their government buys gas at current high market prices but passes it on to consumers at a lower cost and pays the difference itself. This eases pressure on households but drives up demand and could create supply issues.
With these propositions on the table, EU leaders now have to come to an agreement on how to lower prices while securing energy supplies for next winter.
And Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been talking to lawmakers in the Bundestag ahead of that EU summit meeting. He told them Russian leader Vladimir Putin has failed in his efforts to divide European Union countries by using energy as a weapon.
Putin hoped by turning off the gas he'd be able to blackmail us. But he miscalculated there as well. Because Europe stands together, and we as a country have made sure through the measures taken in recent weeks and months that we can say with optimism, together we will come through this winter.
How will it do that, though? Coming back to our political correspondent Nina Hase at the Bundestag, Schultz said in his speech that Europe can afford to withstand this crisis. What is Germany willing to do to achieve this then?
Well, Olaf Scholz reiterated essentially all his plans, how Germany is going to get through this winter, but also prepared the public that this effort in supporting Ukraine essentially will continue for quite some time, and it is going to essentially also make people have to sacrifice things. He tried to highlight the complexity of the issue. He said Russia's war on Ukraine has implications worldwide. There is a global food crisis, and so people are also neglecting the climate change transition, essentially efforts to make their own economies greener. This is something because fossil fuels will be needed longer than expected. So Germany, for example, is keeping its coal power plants running longer than they had intended to do. They're also investing in LNG facilities. The first are being set up right now, and the first gas is going to flow by the end of the year. So in terms of energy security, there are quite a lot of measures in place here already to get through this winter, and this is something where Olaf Scholz said we were dependent on Russian gas, but we are no longer.
Nina Hase for us. Thank you very much for covering today's proceedings. Interesting stuff. And a reminder of the top story we're following for you. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has given a policy statement to Parliament outlining the challenges facing his country in light of the Ukraine war. He underlined Western alliances against what he said was an imperialist war of aggression and said Russia's President Vladimir Putin would not achieve his aims. Touching on the rising cost of living, he said the government was looking into ways to ensure energy supplies would continue to be available. I'm Ben Fazul, and keep watching. Bye-bye.